Culture, what is it? Is it just a construct? Is it an agreed upon system of beliefs and activities and mores? Or something we can just willy-nilly change when we want? One of the concepts of the Invincible storyline, and why I chose Omni-Man for this specifically, is because his culture or his people were coming to Earth to evaluate it for its suitability for colonization in the future. Now, we're watching a different one, a different kind of story play out here in this video today. But the idea of examining the culture from kind of almost a third-person angle will help us understand, its value, what the future looks like, and some of the things we should consider when we do try to change things, etc. So I want to look at this as a bit of more of just an educational look, not necessarily an old-fashioned look, not necessarily a futuristic look, but kind of like here's the here and now, and help you assess and understand some of the primary properties of what Earth's culture is like.
In accordance with our instructions, we continued toward the planet which its inhabitants call the Earth, in order to study their mode of life. The intelligent creatures on this planet call themselves human beings, and they exist in an amazing variety of conditions. Some live in heat-laden jungles, wearing very little clothing on their bodies. We found others who cover their bodies with great gaudiness, even though the heat may be just as great. Some shovel food into their mouths with tiny silver utensils. Some use sticks of bamboo wood. And some use the 5 tentacle-like extensions which grow from the lower part of each hand.
So this is a fairly short video. We'll zip through it and probably skip over some things, but it's from an account called Encyclopedia Britannica Films, hosted on archive.org. Check it out, called Man and His Culture. What you'll see here is you'll see that the perspective of a third-party person is that there are certain activities that happen in slightly different ways, but are pretty much uniform across the world. And then there's others that are just kind of nuances of each other, and maybe some things that are extremely different because of developmental levels, etc.
Some live in huts made from branches and leaves which grow abundantly nearby. And some laboriously build huge structures which they slowly fashion out of steel and stone.
Now, anytime you do see differences like this, you should be able to ask yourself why. And that should prompt a certain level of thinking, like, why are some in huts and why are some building these? And help you dig deeper into understanding the motivations and drivers behind your neighbor, and your world.
And yet, in spite of these great differences, we found that all these human beings share many things in common. Each group has built up its own established mode of living together, a network of customs, habits, attitudes, and ways of doing things which it has acquired through the ages. This mode of life is called by the Earth's social scientists the culture of the group. It provides an organized system of behavior for the members of the group, giving them a framework within which to shape their lives and present.
We should probably repeat this part and just watch it again, because it gives you a definition of what culture is, and then by using that definition, you can start to understand its importance.
Of the group. It provides an organized system of behavior for the members of the group, giving them a framework within which to shape their lives and presenting them with common motives and goals toward which they direct their everyday activities.
So you'll see the common framework and goals is pretty important. When you talk about foundational principles, like a framework for running your society, becomes a paramount thing that if you take it away or you modify it in awkward ways, it actually destroys the fabric and foundation of your culture. So it's not something that's just sit down, people make up and plan out, but it's something that everyone agrees to and that's reinforced throughout society as it grows.
Culture has marked the way. These cultures are vastly different from each other. The kind of land in which the culture exists plays an important part in shaping its pattern. Biological characteristics may account for some of the differences between cultures. But the main reason why there are so many different kinds of culture among the people of the earth are the differences in their historical experiences.
So we see there what they're saying, right, is that the experiences of a specific people group has influence over the culture that ends up resulting in that people group, and that they're the moral fabric or the cultural and social expectations of individuals is built from that experience that built the culture that then builds the properties that everyone ought to adhere to be part of that culture.
There are many universal problems faced by all people, which their different cultures solve in their own ways. They all have ways of taking care of their material welfare, such as getting food and ways of providing shelter for their bodies. They have ways of getting tools and instruments and other things that they need to help them satisfy their wants. They all have some kind of family organization in which the culture will be learned and perpetuated. This is one of the most basic factors in every culture.
Okay, again, bueno,
So you see there was things like food and shelter, and then family was one of the cornerstones of culture. And without it, it would not perpetuate.
All human cultures have language, and there are thousands of different ones.
How much is this?
Wie viel habe ich dafür zu bezahlen?
这个多少钱?
Quanto costa questo? इसका दाम क्या है?
In addition, they all have gestures, which sometimes make mere vocal language seem quite inadequate as a means of communication. Every culture provides a means for those members who conform to maintain their self-respect and the respect of others. All cultures, through their various religions and mythologies, provide some explanation of man's place in the universe.
Well, we should probably talk about conformity for 1 second. The idea of conforming to a specific culture, I don't want to dive into too much today how we view these things, but there have been culture wars over the eras and obviously today. But the idea that culture is like enforcing stuff on someone in a restrictive way, even though the specific activity or concept or idea, and they'll get into it kind of in a second, isn't necessarily harmful or limiting to the person. In fact, if you adopt the principle, you will have success and be affirmed and considered or seen as considerate of the culture. And that's important in itself because it's a group that has to work together regardless. But once you isolate yourself and just focus on your own specific wants that might be countercultural, you have a very significant decision point in your life.
And every culture has its way of expressing a love of what its own people think is beautiful. However, their tastes may differ from that of other cultures. Every culture has a strong code of what is right and wrong in conduct, which often helps to keep things running smoothly. This code is called by the Earth social scientists the mores of the culture. For example,
yes, so this is interesting, and they'll get into examples, but this is interesting because you want to have a smooth, predictable culture. You want to know that if I work this way, I save money for this thing, I can then do this thing, I can have this work, or have this family, or have this society that will look like X, Y, and Z. But when you do not adhere to cultural norms or mores, then you are basically saying you want to disrupt the predictability of certain things that have been well developed and honed over a long period of time. So it's kind of core to a conservative mindset where you want to conserve the cultural values. Doesn't mean there's never any change, but it does mean that you have some predictability, and you're basically saying you're not interested in that predictability the way it used to be. So you have to be very careful because you can choose a poisonous pill and not realize you basically just shot yourself in the foot by checking out of the culture.
example, It is part of the mores of the culture in the country which its inhabitants call United States to respect private property. And although the streets of this country are lined with four-wheeled vehicles, all looking very much alike, the individual will ignore every vehicle but one, which he calls his own. So powerful is the force of a culture that in a society where male members on certain occasions are expected to wear small horizontal decorations under their chins, a member who instead wears a vertical decoration suffers...
Yeah, okay, there's a couple of jokes in here about the, kind of frivolities of how you dress, but...
In some cultures, it may be considered right and proper for a man to have more than one wife. But in the culture of the United States, should a male have a strand of hair from a female not his wife, a serious crisis may result. The mores may be different for different situations within the same culture. On public beaches, a person may be seen with very little clothing on his body, and this is considered quite natural. But should the same person appear on a street, even though he may have more clothing on his body, if he's wearing the wrong type of clothing, this would be a violation of the mores of his culture. Not only would he shock other members of his society and cause great disturbance, but his society might also take official action to stop him from this violation of its mores.
Yeah, so I mean, without talking too much about cops and civic order, but that's a really great summary of it. That there are official ways to enforce the cultural mores, and the official ways of doing that are actually like a benefit to the culture and its predictability, its reliability, its efficiency going forward. So when you want to like change how those things are enforced, you're literally spinning a wheel or throwing a dice to see how things will change downstream.
Generation after generation, this complex pattern of culture traits is handed down. The group has two ways of transmitting its culture to ensure its continued existence. One way is through the natural tendency of children to imitate their elders and to learn from them. Another way is through the direct teaching of the culture to the younger generation.
No, it's still my turn. My turn.
Children, you must share your things. You mustn't be selfish. People should always share things.
Oh, well, right here.
Yeah, we all have, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what are the great sayings or teachings from your own parents or grandparents growing up. Also, the difference between being raised by a parent who wants to kind of instill these cultural mores in you versus maybe a babysitter or a nanny or something like that might actually instill different cultural norms because of their background and their experience from where they've come from. So it's an interesting scenario to underline that it's families that perpetuate the culture. If you start to break down families, you're going to inadvertently destroy the culture.
Teaching in schools plays a large part in keeping a culture alive through the generations.
That was why he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." To him, individual liberty was more important than life itself.
This does not mean, of course, that every individual soaks up the culture of his group in exactly the same way. The individual accepts or rejects specific culture traits, depending on many things. For example, his own personality and the environment from which he comes are extremely important factors in determining what he accepts and rejects.
So an important aspect here is, of course, they had to find some boy drawing a hangman doodle. But the important thing to remember here is that there needs to be a place for everyone, and sometimes your culture becomes more and more solidified to reinforce certain specific behaviors, and eventually slowly squeeze out some. So it's kind of like if your ultimate goal is only for efficiency, you will start to neglect other things like creativity, etc. So in this example, you have someone who's probably bored out of their mind because they're not being stimulated by how the teacher is delivering something, etc. So I can apply those kind of current cultural concepts to this old video and say, like, look, obviously you can't just view this as a rebellious person or someone who's got a bad background in life, but also to look at the culture itself and go, oh, there needs to be a place for this kind of person, and maybe this class isn't where they should be, for example.
But there are only certain culture traits on which there can be a choice of acceptance or rejection. For example, the woman who works at a career has chosen to ignore the culture trait that considers the woman's place is in the home. She can do this without serious repercussions. But the same culture requires that women must be married to have children. And this culture trait is too strong for her to attempt to violate. She has no choice but to conform or be subject to great criticism.
Well, I mean, there's two really good examples there, or food for thought. You can change the way that a family functions and individuals function within it to a certain extent. And you can now also go well beyond the example in this video and say, okay, what happens when you continue to change those things that were supposedly unchangeable in previous generations? There will be a downstream cultural impact, that is for sure.
A culture which permits a certain amount of flexibility makes for a more individualistic people. A culture which demands too rigid conformity tends to stifle individual initiative. Thus, the individual himself is shaped by his culture, just as he helps to shape it. Because of this constant interplay between the individual and his culture, every culture on the planet Earth is always changing, sometimes rapidly and sometimes very slowly. These changes occur in different ways. One is through diffusion of culture traits from one culture to another.
So those cultures that are isolated or literally have barriers, whether it's land or ocean or walls or fences, whatever, will preserve their culture longer. Cultural diffusion from other cultures can't get in, then it's not going to be really additive whatsoever.
The primitive native quickly adopts many of the advanced culture's tools, whose value is readily apparent to him. On the other hand, primitive culture traits like the Indian maize are quickly adopted by the advanced cultures who see value in them. The Indian's tobacco has been adopted by advanced cultures all over the world. The white man's foot is often clad in the Indian's moccasin, just as the white man's shoes are seen on the Indian's foot. The Indian has found great value in the white man's vehicles, and the white man has found important values in the Indian's vehicle too.
So this is fascinating to me because there's so much cultural diffusion and overlap in history that these are just overly simplified examples, right, about food and transportation, etc., from a third person's angle. Obviously, there's been way more mixing of cultures over millennia that would have occurred. So it's not really as kind of cut and dried as this, but you get the point, right?
So cultures grow and change through their interaction on each other in the process called cultural diffusion. Another way in which cultures change is through invention and discovery. Every technological development brings about a greater or lesser change in the culture pattern. It can well be imagined what an infinite number of culture traits are bound up with a primary invention such as the wheel, and with a primary discovery like the use of fire. Such primary inventions and discoveries have made possible the immensely complicated developments of a technological age. An example is the vehicle called the automobile, which runs on 4 wheels and whose engine is driven by fire. Its introduction brought vast culture changes, especially in the country called the United States. The whole pattern of living of that nation has been changed. People are moving out of the city into suburban areas. Farmers are in closer contact with the towns. Transportation of goods has been revolutionized. These are only a few of the great number of new culture traits which have been formed around the invention of the automobile.
And it's worth noting there too that that's a kind of a cultural diffusion as well, both mixing of rural and urban environments and people from those environments going to live in each other's environments. This film is from 1954. Back then, a majority of the population lived in rural environments. It wasn't until the late 2010s or around there that the majority of people, at least in North America, lived in urban environments. And when I say majority, I mean just over 50% happened just in the last couple decades. That would be a lot of overlap and diffusion going on there, right?
But the inhabitants of planet Earth do not always welcome culture changes. There is often a resistance to anything different from the habits of the past.
Julie, when I was a girl, we wouldn't have been caught dead with no more clothes on than that. My stars, what are our young people coming to these days?
Oh, Granny, everybody dresses like this.
Well, I don't approve of it.
Material culture traits like clothing change faster than non-material culture traits. The youth still feels he should walk on the street side of his companion, even though the material reasons, such as muddy streets, no longer exist.
So it's fascinating to me because even in this example, this is an example of external cultural influence over your own culture. You have to trace it back to really understand where it came from, why it was developed, what the purpose was, and those answers are out there, but you have to go and look for them. Just saying it as if past generations are stodgy, old, fun-killing people is a little different than saying, oh, a culture somewhere else started to have an influence in your culture because of some change, some movement of people, some philosophical development, etc. So, we need to look back at those things and understand them for what they really are, not just look at them as some kind of benign idea that somebody happened to come up with and go, oh, and now everybody wants to do it.
The military man's salute, originally to lift the visor of the knight's helmet, continues in spite of the fact that knights have been gone for hundreds of years. But even though material culture traits change more easily than non-material, change of any kind is often opposed by vested interests.
We just can't do it, Jim. We've got too much tied up in present.
So this is a good example of don't change this thing. This thing's gonna take away our jobs, etc., and all of that stuff. Obviously does happen and continues to happen. And others manipulate things so that they can get wealthy and maintain their monopoly on something. But that's not necessarily a something that you and I can really influence. So it's yet another external factor to be realized.
In spite of such opposition, cultures are always changing. New ways of doing and of thinking gradually take hold. But the basic mores on which each culture is built change very slowly. Thus, they provide a set of fairly stable, long-range goals, which all the people of a given culture seek together in their effort to live in a way which they consider satisfying.
So I like that they tied in the concept of satisfaction, because at the end of the day, there are ways that things are done. There are values and properties of a culture that don't really matter at some levels. Others that are developed over time, or cultural history, or emerging of people and migration of people, etc. So some of them are just preferences, right, at the end of the day. But there are also good reasons that certain things are in place. And let's rewind that for a sec. Yes, long-term goals and long-term stability is what built the Western economic system and the philosophical system that undergirds, which is typically commonly tied back to Christian values, but it's more than that, because there's a lot of stuff around that you'd call like the trappings of the culture that are not a Christian principle per se. So when you're looking at long-term stability, though, for a people group, it's very important, because you need to make investment, personal or commercial investment, in your culture, and you expect certain output comes from that culture. For example, it is my belief that one of the things I want to do was my belief was that if I follow the cultural values that I grew up being taught, that I will then be able to pass those along to my children, And likewise, they will benefit from the social, economic, cultural value that I benefited from, right? But if culture is changing too rapidly or changing at all, I guess, in certain areas, that won't necessarily be true. So the long-term expectation of, well, here are the things you must do to be successful, for example, will change and will not be as predictable. So it has to be approached very carefully and very considerately, in a very considerate manner.
Cultures seek together in their effort to live in a way which they consider satisfying. As already pointed out, there are innumerable different cultures on the planet Earth. Many encompass a very small group, involving only a tribe or a series of villages. Such tiny culture groups dot the continent which the Earth people call Africa. On the other hand, the continent called Europe is largely covered by a huge civilized culture which is spread over many parts of the Earth. But whether a culture is a tribal way of life or a great civilization, it serves its people in the same way, by setting up goals for a way of life through which they can achieve personal happiness if they conform. Thus, knowing the culture of any group charts the way to a fuller understanding of the people themselves.